Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 33 of The Kill File. I am so glad that you guys are back for the second part of the Gorilla Killer, aka the Dark Strangler, aka Earle Nelson. I just wanted to quick throw out a reminder that on the website, thekillfile.com, you can submit the little forum for cases that you want to see covered here, and you can let me know if you want me to shout out your name as well. Also, don't forget, if you want to help out The Kill File, hit that download button on your episodes, as that will allow sponsors to see how many people are listening. Okay, so last week we learned a lot about Earle Nelson's background and where he came from. I know we got to cover, I believe, the first two killings in a long list of killing that we are going to jump into today. If you remember from last week, after the second killing, Earle jumped on a train headed back to San Francisco, believing God to be leading the way for him. Fair warning, today will be a little rough in a few places, but I refuse to leave out parts of a story, no matter how awful, because the victim deserves their stories to be told, and we deserve to know the kind of people that are among us. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, rape, necrophilia, murder of a minor, infanticide, child sexual assault and rape, talks of suicide, and brutality. Let's jump in. A widow named Lillian St. Mary was in shambles after the death of her husband and needed money badly. Her adult son was still at home, and in desperation, she decided to rent out empty rooms to boarders just to make enough to scrape by. Lillian, at the age of 63, did the best she could, but because she couldn't see that well, the house was mostly in a dingy state, completely covered in dust, and because of the unkempt state of the house, there wasn't many people knocking on the door trying to rent a room. Lillian had been leaving the house when a large man scared her accidentally, as Earle told her that he was just wanting to know about the room for rent. Poor Lillian was so excited and relieved that someone could want to stay there and that the money would help with the burdensome bills. As Earle was going on and on with his usual story of excuses and reasons, Lily wasn't even paying attention because of her overexcitement, and as she was showing Earle the room and explaining the fee and schedule of the dinners, etc., Earle locked the door behind them. He grabbed Lillian by the throat immediately, and he brought her to the ground and stayed on top of her, to where she could not breathe, and the weight of this beast kept the air from her lungs, and although she tried to get out from underneath him, she would succumb to his will. It was said Earle could see her face, and the pain and pressure, the squeezing and lack of air had caused her eyes to bulge, and within moments, she was dead. It was over so quickly, he barely noticed her trying to fight. After taking care to remove her clothing and folding them, he pushed up her skirts using his own body and face to take in his pleasures of this dead woman's flesh, as he had his way with her corpse over and over again. Leaving as quietly as he came, the only person to spot him at all was one of the local trolley drivers who had caught a glimpse of him as he was coming out of the building. Later that day, Lillian was found by another tenant, and come to find out, there had been a tenant downstairs from the unused room where Earle had committed his heinous acts, and the man didn't hear a word or noise at all. After this murder, the papers would write warnings to all women not to show any boarding rooms without someone else present, as the city became heightened with fear. As a month would pass before anything was heard about the Dark Strangler, a joke about how this man hadn't been a man at all, but rather a gorilla instead, made the city, rather than think of this man as the literal monster he was, but into a joke as the murder got further away. This stuck out to me how this kept happening in the beginning of Earle's rampage, because it very much reminded me of how this happens in real life. Not that murders become jokes, but rather the fact that as time fills the gap between school shootings, I feel like our nation and our people do the same thing, where at first it's a huge deal, and everyone's enraged and demanding change, and poor parents and families are grief-stricken, and the whole country is in an uproar, and then within weeks the commotion dies down, and people seem to forget or move on until the next one happens. It's awful for everyone involved that this is our reality, just like for the people of California, this was their reality. Earle's next destination would be Santa Barbara, which is said to be quite different from the big city life back at this time. Of course, locals here had heard of the gorilla killer, but there was never a thought in anyone's mind that things like this would happen in this slower-paced, smaller community. In a local boarding house of Miss Ollie Russell, there was a man named Will Franny who was said to be a railroad worker who had to sleep during the day and worked at night. One day after just a few hours of sleep, he began to hear a knock, which he thought was somebody knocking at his room door, and was very upset as everyone knew the hours he worked. As he drug himself to his feet and looking through the peephole, no one was there. This is when he realized that someone was knocking on the wall next to his bed. He walked into the hall, ready to confront whoever was knocking, as he was pissed. It had interrupted his much-needed sleep. This is when he would realize, in his half-asleep state, that the apartment or room next to his was empty. When Will peered through the keyhole to figure out what was going on, he saw a dark man on the bed, over top of a woman clearly in a suggestive position, and Will realized it was the headboard that was banging against the wall. At first, he thought maybe this man was the new tenant and was confused, as Mr. and Mrs. Russell ran their house under stringent rules, which once wouldn't even allow Will to have his girl cousin in the main rooms without one of the Russells' supervision. This forced Will to blush and head back to his room, all the while pondering who was in there and doing such unspeakable acts under the Russells' roof. Since he didn't recognize the man, he thought it must be one of the women tenants, and as Will intended to let Miss Russell know what was going on in her boarding house, he needed to get another look at the woman to see who it was. He quietly went back into the hall and looked through the keyhole once again, where he was able to see the leg and a thigh of a woman with lace white socks, but the pattern and coloring of the clothing is what stopped Will in his tracks. Was this not the outfit that he had often seen Miss Russell wearing? When he realized who it was, he jerked his head back from the keyhole, but was in absolute disbelief. She was a strict married woman who would never have an affair with a strange man. When Will looked again, desperate to see the woman's features to prove to himself that it wasn't the landlady, he would know without a doubt that this was in fact Mrs. Russell. He felt sick to his stomach. He went back to his room and he forced himself to lay back down, wondering why she would do this, all the while having to listen to the thumping on the wall again and again. Suddenly, it stopped. As Will heard the man leaving, knowing that the man would have to walk right past his door to get out, he had considered looking through the peephole to see his face, but he couldn't do it. He did, however, go back to the supposedly empty room after the man left and tried to open the door, which was locked. Peering through the keyhole, he knew for sure this was Miss Russell, but she was laying in the same position, but this time he could see blood around her neck and on the sheets as well. As no one but Mr. Russell had a key to the room, he found him and brought him home to open the door. The police would come shortly afterwards. There was blood everywhere with what they could see as a cord pulled so tightly around her neck, it broke the skin and flesh. They knew Ollie had been dead before she was raped, which meant Will had been listening to this hulking man ravaging her dead body, as the thumping had continued for so long. As word of the crimes and the necrophilia spread around Santa Barbara, everyone was on edge waiting for the gorilla killer to strike again. The next strike would come in Oakland on August 26, 1926. A man named Stephen Nisbet was coming home from work agitated with the heat and the humidity, as the rest of the town surely was as well. As he walked into the kitchen, there had been a half-prepared dinner, and as he was in his bedroom, he realized his wife Mary's purse was still there, which meant she hadn't left. So Stephen did the most 1920s thing that he could think of and just sat in the kitchen at the table waiting for his wife to return and finish cooking his food. He sat there for an hour, waiting until he finally asked the other boarders to help him look for his wife. Mr. Nisbet was familiar with the gorilla killer, the Dark Strangler, as San Francisco wasn't far from Oakland. He knew in his gut something was wrong as he played out what could have happened in his head. As he headed to the empty second-floor apartment, he could see the bathroom door was cracked. He didn't want to see, as he already was seeing blood on the floor when he spotted his wife's mangled corpse shoved down next to the toilet. He knew already. He called the police. Earle had used the dish towel that Mary always had on her to strangle the life out of her, and they could see that Earle had knocked every tooth out of this poor woman's face with the sheer force that was used to slam her head into the walls and onto the floor. Absolutely brutal. They actually arrested Stephen because the authorities knew that it was a crime of passion, but eventually, as Earle was slipping out of town, they checked Stephen's alibi and knew it was not him. At the time, Earle was leaving the state, still holding the Bible, still dressed in a black suit full of blood. Beta Withers was missing from her boarding house in Portland, Oregon on October 19th, 1926, and another missing the very next day was Miss Virginia Grant. Virginia went missing, however, from a property that she had owned during a visit, maybe even a showing. Mabel Fluke disappeared the very next day after Virginia, Mabel from her own home. When Earle first met Beta, who was only the age of 35, it took him back as she was not the age of his other victims, not the mother figure from his own life, who was strict and controlling. Earle was confused why God would bring him such a young woman, until something Beta did instantly reminded him of Aunt Lillian, the first person that Earle had ever had sexual feelings towards. As he killed and raped the poor woman's corpse, he was able to fulfill his lusts from so long ago. This time, though, Earle felt something he didn't usually feel: shame. He felt he needed to hide the evidence this time, where usually he didn't feel like he had to do anything with any of them. He felt this quote-unquote Lillian deserved his kindness, and since she was so good to him, he could repay her in this way. He took her dead body up to the attic, emptied a trunk, and folded up the dead woman's body inside. Earle felt satisfied that no one would be able to see her shame or know what she had done. The mind of this man is so intriguing, victim-blaming at its finest. Virginia wasn't given any kindness from Earle, as she had met him at a house that she was trying to get someone to rent. Earle used one of his old habits to get Virginia to lift her chin for easier access to her throat by saying something about the ceiling or the molding, which inevitably caused the woman to glance up. As his killings went on, they got easier and easier, as now he was mastering his craft. This time, though, as Earle was leaving, he felt another feeling, except this time it wasn't shame. It was more like a feeling of incomplete work. Grandmother had taught Earle the good old saying of cleanliness being next to godliness, yet Virginia's body laying there was messy. Earle took her body and stuffed it next to the old boiler, feeling rather satisfied with himself. Now, Mabel Fluke, when no one could find her, nor heard from her, and as the other women were being found around town, it was known the Dark Strangler had made his presence in Oregon. Poor Mabel was finally found, not because of diligent searching, but rather for the stench of decomposition. Mabel never left her boarding house. In fact, she had been there all along. One of the boarding house dwellers finally checked the attic and found poor Mabel stuffed into the very edge of the attic. While the fine people of Portland did not want to admit that the gorilla killer was amongst them, even having a 6-person jury hung 3 and 3 on Virginia Grant committing suicide and stuffing herself next to the boiler, with the other 3 thinking it was murder. Duh. Spoiler alert, it was. And now Portland was forced to admit that this killer had also become their problem, as they attempted to track Earle down, but as one of his aliases, Mr. Woodcocks, they got closer and closer, and were able to find his real name from some of the sex workers in San Francisco, and now the world would know Earle Nelson was the gorilla killer, the Dark Strangler. Lillian and Willis were hounded for information, but as Earle had always had a nomadic lifestyle, they only had pieces of information. The workers at the hospitals that he had once been held at were open to giving stories about the beastly man, all of which helped people to believe that he was an animal in nature. To everyone's surprise, Earle headed back to San Francisco for his next attack. No one thought that he would ever dare to come back, knowing that everyone was looking for him. On November 18th, Mr. William Edmonds would come home to find his wife, Anna, only 35 years old, strangled. Earle had used a rag to murder Anna and then, of course, raped her corpse. On the next day, he would kill again not far from the Bay Area in a place called Burlingame, which was known as a relatively crime-free area and was known for their groves of eucalyptus. Miss Murray was selling a home on Grove Avenue when she would get a telegram that someone was interested in looking at the home. When she arrived at the empty home, she looked upon a stranger who didn't seem alarming, but rather a gentle giant. Earle tried desperately to get Miss Murray down to the basement to quote-unquote look at the boiler, but Miss Murray had to explain that she couldn't go down the stairs out of fear because she was quite far along in her pregnancy. She did, however, offer for her husband to show Earle the boiler and items in the basement. Earle instead baited Miss Murray to look up yet again. Earle grabbed her throat. Miss Murray fought Earle, pleading for her life and her unborn son's life, as Miss Murray was only 25 years old. Hearing this made Earle stop in his tracks, as he thought about how he didn't want that little boy to have to live abandoned by his mother as he once was. Earle saw not pleasures of the flesh anymore, but his own mother in Miss Murray. He let go of Miss Murray as she screamed and ran up the stairs. When she finally was able to get out of the house and try to find the authorities, Earle had vanished. All of California was on edge, waiting for another story and horrific event from the Dark Strangler. The next place the gorilla killer would strike was Washington, as a woman named Florence Monk's body had been found strangled to death behind the furnace of her home in Seattle. She had been robbed, which made the authorities believe that this could be someone different. As last anyone heard, the Dark Strangler was still in California. There had not been any prior reports of Earle robbing his victims until now. As different authority locations still struggled to share information, and this one not being linked to Earle yet, he was able to slip away. Earle arrived at a boarding house in Portland on November 25th using another alias of Adrian Harris, this time to have a look at a room for rent. Edna Gaylord and one of the tenants named Sophie Yates entertained Earle as he paid them for a week in advance, set his things in his room, and went back down to have a nice chat with the women. As Edna was sitting there explaining to Earle her desperate need of money to the point of not being able to afford a Thanksgiving dinner this year. At this, Earle got up abruptly and left the boarding house, to which Sophie got a good kick out of, but Edna was upset. A little later, Adrian, aka Earle, came back with all of the food needed for a Thanksgiving dinner, including a good roast and side dishes. These two women, Edna, the elderly, and Sophie, the long-term younger tenant, were thrilled with Adrian, as the three sat down to dine and drink and chat. These two women seemed to be the pattern that Earle's killings followed, the elderly and the young woman. A woman in her 40s named Blanche Myers had long been the owner of a boarding house that was located in the same city, Portland. As everyone still had thought that the gorilla killer was still in California, she was not afraid when a Mr. Williams wanted to see the room for rent as he entered the boarding house. Blanche was strangled with what was said to be a handkerchief, and afterwards Earle carried the body to her own bed and raped her, then stuffed her corpse under the bed. Earle had left some fingerprints in blood on the doorknob as he was leaving. When Earle returned to the boarding house he had been staying in, he quickly packed his things, even though he was paid through for 2 more days. As what was supposed to be an early Christmas gift to Edna and Sophie, he gave the woman a necklace and a ring that he had found in his bags. Soon the murder news had spread throughout Portland, and also there had been information leaked about some items of clothing that were pawned in Portland that were actually from a deceased Florence Monk in Washington. They now believed these items were stolen and pawned from the gorilla killer. Shortly after the news of this spread, and barely within 24 hours, Edna and Sophie went to the authorities with their Christmas gifts, while the police confirmed these items had been taken from Mrs. Monk's home in Seattle. Sophie and Edna then realized this whole time the man who had given them gifts, bought them food, and spent time with them was the Dark Strangler. Can you imagine the shiver that would go through your whole body knowing how close to death you probably were this entire time? Holy shit. As the entire West Coast was on their toes waiting, watching, terrified of the gorilla killer, Earle was making his way nearly 2,000 miles from his last horror. Almira Berard had been finally coming home for Christmas, as she had spent most of the year in a psychiatric ward due to a breakdown that she had suffered from the crumbling of her marriage. She was only 41 years old when she faked her way through the discharge of the ward, knowing by society's standards that she was already a spinster of sorts, and would be looked down upon for life for not being able to hold together her first marriage. I gotta cut in here quick and say that I cannot imagine living in these times where a 41-year-old woman who was divorced was looked upon with such disdain. So many women in these days suffered at the hand of their abusers and were too afraid or ashamed to separate from the men that caused them so much harm. I'm not saying that this is what happened with Almira. I actually have no idea why she had gotten divorced. But I know through so much history that women have suffered in silence and were expected to just take it, and it makes me sick. These poor women were the ones looked at like as if there was something wrong with them when their marriages didn't last for whatever reason. Why weren't the men looked down upon? Why was it always the women's fault for a marriage not working out? I can't imagine the pressure and the shame and feelings of just defeat women must have felt at this time. I just want to go back and lead a female revolution of sorts against the pigs that abused them and made them feel less than. I know what it feels like, and it makes me angry that so many of us had to go through this, and it's not okay. It's still happening. And still, there is such a stigma attached to divorce. It's bullshit. Sometimes things don't work out, and that's okay. Wouldn't we rather each person in a relationship be happy and be themselves, even if it means divorce? For fuck's sake, it's a piece of paper. If that's all that is holding some couples together, it shouldn't be that way. You get one life. People deserve to spend it happy. And don't even get me started on what kids are being shown or taught in an unhappy household. They are watching, learning, and getting used to the feelings, and the cycle of unhappiness may continue and feel normal. It's sad for us as people. I say fuck the haters and live your life. Okay, moving on. In Elmira's divorce, she was able to keep the home in Council's Bluff, Iowa, but for now a single woman, the house would feel empty and huge. She would place an ad in the newspaper for a room to rent, as she had no fear of the gorilla killer. That was a West Coast problem, not Iowa's. When Mr. Williams came knocking to see the room for rent, she saw a quiet, pleasant man around 30 years old. It's unclear how long he stayed with her, if at all, but what is clear is he had strangled her with a silken ligature. It was also said she died very quickly as Earle pounced her from behind. After she was dead, Earle took her to her room to violently rape her remains. And because this woman didn't fit into either category of the grandmother or the young woman, Earle was unsure how to feel and what to do when it was finished. Apparently, he just smoothed out Elmira's clothes and then left. Fucking weird. The authorities didn't believe this to be the attack of the gorilla killer, as this was so far away from the West Coast. The next victim was a young woman of 23 years old, and this murder took place in Kansas City, Missouri. Poor Bonnie Pace had a sign in the window of her home that her and her husband together ran, and when Earle was done with the woman, he stuffed her remains under her own bed. Now this part is going to be sickening and sad, and I hate it, but it's part of the story, unfortunately, so I'm just going to glaze over it quickly, as it's going to hurt. The very next day, a woman named Germania Harpin fell victim to Earle as well, as he strangled her with a rag, took her dead body to the bed, had his sickening way with the remains, and stuffed her corpse under the bed. As Earle was making his way out, he heard an unfamiliar sound that stopped him in his tracks. A baby was crying. It gave Earle pause as he was leaving. He stopped, turned around, and went up to the nursery that held baby Robert, who laid there crying at 8 months old. This is when Earle realized the baby must have been taking a nap, which is why he didn't hear or recognize a baby was in the home. He unswaddled the baby and used the diaper to kill the infant. The book I had read before this case goes into more detail, and let me tell you, I was shocked in the moment I read it and was pissed that it happened and that I didn't see it coming. I didn't know this case, obviously, so I was so upset, and I knew that I would have to include this on here, and as much as I didn't want to, I have to. It's part of the case. I will not leave details out no matter how uncomfortable, because we need to be aware of monsters capable of such heinous acts. In Earle's eyes, this did not register as any different than the countless women that he had killed. In fact, he felt that he was sparing this child from suffering a life that resembled his own. Earle had such a skewed view of the world that he assumed other men were just like him on the inside, and that brothers longed for their own sisters the way that he did. So when he saw the baby, he thought to himself the best thing for it was death, before it too could be tarnished from a world full of sin, hate, and lust. This closed out the year of 1926, as many newspapers wouldn't even run the story of the infanticide, which I can understand at the time, but I also feel like people should be warned that this maniac isn't just killing elderly and young ladies, but also now infants. April 27, 1927, Mary McConnell was strangled to death and her corpse raped as well, as her home was ransacked, and she was located in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. To be exact, in a townhome of her own. He wanted to pawn the things he could and make money to keep going. Next, Earle would hit Buffalo, New York, where his original plan was to stay low-key and out of the public's eye for a while to let things cool off. Earle had taken enough from Miss McConnell that he wouldn't want for anything for a bit, but what he didn't count on was that the man at the pawn shop refusing to buy the items that he felt were stolen goods. He was also smart enough to actually document the items that Earle had brought with him before he left. Earle went back to the boarding house he was staying at, completely full of anger and rage at the pawn man's refusal, and unfortunately, Earle would take this refusal as a sign from God that he was meant to continue on and was not destined to stay in New York long. A woman named Jenny Rudolph was suffering in her own life as she had lost her son. To me, this is the absolute worst thing that can ever happen to a person, so I can't imagine. While she tried to keep going in life full of grief and not knowing what to do with herself, her brother, Gideon Gillette, was there for a sister in her time of need. He had moved in with his sister to help her cope with the loss and was pushing Jenny to rent out her son's room and bring life back into the home. Jenny was of course not ready, but was desperate for anything to take her mind off her son. Gideon went ahead with Jenny's reluctant permission to place an ad for the room, secretly hoping that nothing would come from it. When she was in the darkness of her own room and her own grief, she would hear a knock on the door. But Jenny had no desire to continue to give her energy to those around her, as she needed a break. She heard talking downstairs when Gideon called out for his sister. She wanted to be left in her misery to mourn, but instead she had to head down the stairs to her insistent brother. This is where she would meet Charles Harrison, a man who claimed to be from New York in need of a room, aka Earle. When Earle left the house, Jenny wasn't even sure if he wanted to take it. As Earle had said, he would think on it. Jenny had secretly sort of wanted Mr. Harrison to stay with her, as he was a little younger than her son, but something about him reminded her of him. The owner of the local pawn shop had too turned Earle down and took note of what he was trying to sell and tried to match it with any thefts nearby. As the authorities threw the net out to major cities of lists of items that had been taken in the murders, the items Earle was trying to sell was then connected to Miss McConnell in Philadelphia. Unfortunately for Gideon, he would come home to discover Jenny's remains raped and crumpled under the bed in the daylight. He was feeling extremely riddled with guilt, as he was the one who had pushed her to accept the tenant, that Gideon would unfortunately commit suicide, as he could not live with the guilt. This time Earle would head to Detroit, as he had dodged the authorities. As he got off the train, he headed straight towards a boarding house where he planned to kill again. Fannie Mae's boarding house had been where it was running for over a full decade, as Fannie was 60 years old now. She didn't usually have a room open, as most of the tenants had been there for a long time, and as Fannie interviewed Earle, so did Maureen, one of the residents that had been there a long time. They were trying to figure out this man, and Maureen would be the one who would show Earle the room, as Fannie didn't want to go up the damn stairs if she didn't have to. The house grew quiet as Fannie sat there waiting. She would have went on waiting, sitting there for a long time, if the fuse hadn't blown out the power in the house. Instead of making her way to the basement in the dark to find the fuse box, she let the house guide her and headed upstairs when she heard a thumping noise that was in a rhythmic symphony. As she entered the empty room, she saw this strange new man raping Maureen. She noticed the lamp that had been knocked over and the cord cut and used as a ligature. Fannie could see the blood on Maureen's neck and body. All of a sudden, Earle whipped around and headed towards the frail elderly Franny when he realized that she was standing there. She was frozen, still, no noises escaping her, as the naked man, with his giant erection, stomped towards her and then grabbed her throat as well. Earle strangled and raped both dead women and burglarized the home. When the authorities would be called, they didn't realize this too would be connected to the Dark Strangler. The next place Earle headed to strike again was in Chicago, Illinois, as he found a woman named Mary Sietsema, who had also had an empty room for rent. After Mary was found, this would be the 24th woman that would fall victim to the Dark Strangler. These poor women needed the money and probably never thought things like this would happen to them. Earle used a lamp cord to strangle Mary, but this time he didn't cut it. He took from Mr. Sietsema a sweater, some brown sandals, and a blue suit. He ransacked the house, and as he left this area, he realized that the United States was no longer a place of freedom for him, as he was known almost everywhere. Earle decided to leave America for now and head to Canada, a place untouched by the Dark Strangler and ripe for the picking. Earle headed to Winnipeg on a train where upon his arrival, he would trade his suit at a thrift shop, and instead he donned an outfit of a regular workman. He knew that without his usual suit, it may be harder to charm his way into the boarding houses, carrying his Bible and quoting scripture to put the women at ease. Earle had planned on just laying low again, as his lusts had been filled for now. Earle felt that God had been bountiful with the women he handed Earle, and he needed a break, having only murdered a mere 6 days ago. Earle would now go by the name of Mr. Woodcotts as he approached the home of Catherine Hill in Winnipeg. And as this boarding house was usually only for men of better substance, Catherine thought that maybe having a man around the house like Earle to help with different repairs could be useful. After all, he was a workman. Catherine would offer Earle his room, having discounted the price for his work around the house, which worked well for both of them. When Catherine bid Mr. Woodcotts adieu that first evening, she left, seeing Earle holding his Bible, and felt good about her choice. As Earle was relatively invisible in Winnipeg, he wandered the streets and happened upon a young girl, only 14 years old, thinking to himself that this is what Aunt Lillian would have looked like if she had been poverty-stricken instead of born into the life that she was. Earle had always felt tormented by his lusts for Aunt Lillian, the first person his desires looked upon. Alright, you guys, this part is going to be the worst part of all of the story, so ready yourself, but we are almost done with the victims, so bear with me. After Earle set his eyes upon this young girl, he started to follow her throughout the entire day. The young girl named Lola came from a family that was struggling and going through it. She had lost her mother when she was younger, and now her father was extremely ill with pneumonia, stuck at home in bed. For now, they had a place to live, but there was no way for the broken family to pay next month's rent, with their father being so sick. Lola's little brother took to folding paper into flowers, and Lola took her little brother door to door or up to anyone on the street, hoping for help. It was said that every couple days the family could eat, but it was very clear that without more money, her father would die from his illness. After following her all day, Earle finally approached Lola and somehow convinced her to come back to his boarding house. We only know there was an offer of money, but it's still not really known in what capacity. But it was said that Lola was an older spirit than what her teenage body had shown. She knew what men were capable of, as men had tried before. So if it was for sex work that Earle had offered to pay her for, he must have offered her a hell of a lot of money to get this young girl to follow this hulking man back to the house. All right, you guys, deep breath, here we go. If you need to skip a little, no shame. Once Earle had Lola to himself, he strangled her, but not to the point of death, as he didn't want this experience to end as quickly as the others. Earle was said to be shaking as he took off her clothing as well as his, as Lola was there knocking on death's door. Although strangled quite a bit, she was still alert as Earle mounted her like the animal he was. Lola cried. This brave young girl tried to fight off her attacker and tried to stop what was happening to her. Although she was on the brink of death, Lola fought back and scratched Earle anywhere she could, including the top of his head. This would enrage Earle to the point that he broke and bit off all 10 of Lola's fingertips as he continued to rape her. Lola then tried to slap Earle in the face as her hands bled, and at this, Earle snapped the poor girl's wrists. She was still fighting, trying to stop him, and was trying to close her legs to end the horror. And I'm sure what must have been so painful for her. At this, Earle would snap poor Lola's femurs like they were small popsicle sticks. Unfortunately for Lola, she was still alive as Earle stuffed the poor girl under the bed. As he had not completely strangled her yet, she couldn't really breathe much. She was forced to lay there under the bed, bleeding profusely and unable to move, as she would hear Earle say his prayers as he was kneeling next to the bed, and then he would climb into the bed and fall asleep. Lola would succumb to her injuries during the night, as I'm sure at this point death would be a mercy for her. The next morning, Earle would remove Lola's body from under the bed and again rape her corpse as if he hadn't done enough. When he finished, he again stuffed her dead body and what was left of it under the bed as her remains were bleeding profusely. Earle then left the boarding house. The next day, Catherine came up to tidy up the place when she saw that Earle, or rather Mr. Woodcott's door, was open, and when she entered the room, she saw that the man and his things were gone. She thought it strange as the man was paid up until a later date, but figured that she was making money because another tenant would come now, so be it. The room was almost immaculate, as apparently Mr. Woodcott wasn't the messiest of people. Lola's little brother looked for his sister endlessly, and since he was so young and the father was out of commission, the authorities weren't even notified about Lola's disappearance. It was said now that Earle had the gift he thought was from God of such a young girl, he would be in search of the other pattern woman, the elderly grandmother figure. When Catherine's next tenant of the room would not stop complaining, she found herself missing the quiet Mr. Woodcott as the new tenant was unhappy about the awful smell and bright sun coming up into the attic too quickly every morning. Catherine went upstairs to check the complaints. She stopped in her tracks at the foul odor, but assumed that it was a dead rodent somewhere in the attic. Once before, a vermin had died under the floor in the space between, and Catherine again assumed this was the case and started popping up floorboards to look under them with her lantern. Flies were now gathering in the room as she knew something must be dead up there, probably never thinking the worst of what she was about to find. As she searched, she had decided to look underneath the bed, and everything went black. The other tenants would find Catherine passed out on the floor as she tried to explain what was under the bed. The other tenants had to look for themselves. When the authorities made their way to the house, it was said that the crumpled up body of Lola didn't even resemble a human at this point. The contortion of her body was unnatural. As Earle was in town visiting thrift stores and talking to the lovely people of Winnipeg, he happened to see a woman through the windows of her home. Emily Patterson wasn't the age that he was looking for, but he couldn't ignore her and saw the sign in her window that they had a room to rent out. Earle felt this to be another sign from God that he could not ignore. He had no money to bring to Emily, as he used his charm to explain that he would be willing to do repairs and physical work around the house if she, in return, would allow him to room for 1 week. She seemed reluctant towards the beast, but she did as he requested when he asked to borrow the tools to start by fixing the hinge on the screen door as a sign of good faith. Emily was still unsure about letting the man room for work, but she brought out her husband's tools to let him fix it, and he did. As people were walking by the house, she could see that Earle was friendly to everyone, smiling and giving a friendly wave. Earle's work on the door was done properly, and when finished, Emily asked Earle to bring the tools back inside, as she had planned on talking to the stranger about their possible arrangement. Earle was overly gratuitous as he grabbed the hammer from the toolbox and smashed Emily over the head with it. This is giving Yorkshire Ripper vibes. She crumpled like a piece of paper. Although not dead yet, Earle smacked her with the hammer again and again. He then used a rag to strangle the poor woman. When Mr. Patterson got home from work, he didn't see any trace of his wife, which frightened him. So much so that before night set in, he had called the authorities to report Emily as missing. He also stated that there had been a suit missing from his wardrobe, and this was said to be a brown suit, and it was described in sources as a whipcord suit. And in my head, I thought that meant like corduroy, but I was definitely wrong. It just looks like a brown suit that you can see kind of like the threads on, if that makes sense. The Pattersons had 2 children that Mr. Patterson was now in charge of taking care of, and he was doing his best, while in his mind fighting back the sensation that he felt his wife was already dead. His children were for good reason frightened at the absence of their mother, as their father put them to bed that night. As Mr. Patterson stood up from his son's bed, his pants got caught on the dust ruffle, and when he went down to unhook it and see under the bed, he found his wife's bloody corpse stuffed under their son's bed. When the authorities did a search, they knew the suit was missing along with some cash, and they found Earle's quote-unquote work clothes that he was disguising himself in stuffed under the bed with Emily. The clothing left behind, along with a small pocket knife that had been used to cut an electrical cord, tied this murder to the Dark Strangler, and now everyone knew this monster was in Canada. A man named George Smith, who was a chief of detectives in Winnipeg, had heard about the murders and decided to jump on board this case himself and start tracking Earle. He questioned witnesses that had seen Earle with Lola the day she had disappeared. Both murder scenes were gone over with a fine-toothed comb. The authorities were able to find the brown whipcord suit that Earle had just traded due to its smaller size, and instead, Earle took a suit that fit him well, and it was black. Good. They knew his clothing at the time. Next to the pawn shop was a barber that Earle had stopped in and got a haircut, and while at the barber, the owner noticed that Earle had some scabbing and blood on the top of his head, presumably from Lola, although of course the barber didn't know this. He was, however, able to tell the police that when he mentioned them to Earle, that Earle got upset and told the man to mind his own business, which was odd. As George Smith tracked Earle, Earle was oblivious to just how close the authorities in Canada were to finding him. People were popping up everywhere with descriptions and encounters with Earle, from the trolley driver to the man who shared a taxi with him. Unluckily for Earle, as George Smith and the rest of the brigade were closing in on Earle, they were able to send out telegrams and called all over the country, telling authorities of his description, his clothing, his aliases, and many of the items that he had stolen that could be on his person. The newspapers were also informed of Earle's identity, and this time, photos were included with the news stories, so everyone would know exactly what Earle looked like, with multiple photos as well as a $1,500 reward for any information that would lead George Smith or the authorities to capturing Earle. Earle, posing as a man named Mr. Harry Harcourt, had been staying in a room for the evening, and before anyone else in the house had woken on June 13th, Earle had made his way down the stairs and wanted to read the paper. He caught a glimpse of himself in the paper as he decided to discard everything the paper had stated he owned or was dressed in. In a rage, he threw the items in the trash that was located in the back of the boarding house. Earle quickly packed the rest of his things and ran over to a store to buy some overalls and a hat. He took the rest of the clothes not named in the paper and took them to a secondhand store to sell, figuring no one would connect him or the clothing to the Dark Strangler. But he would be wrong. When the person working at the store realized that each of the items had a Winnipeg tag on them, he contacted the authorities as they continued to track Earle much closer than he realized. Earle got the hell out of town as he ran into a man who took scrap metal all over, collecting metal from anywhere he could between Regina and Manitoba. Earle paid his way, told the man that he wasn't in a hurry. Then, the metal man took Earle with him, excited to have someone to talk to on the long journey. As the police were out on all of the main roads searching for Earle, lucky for him, the metal man needed to take the back roads to reach the farms and homes he needed to get to. Earle never expected the authority to be the well-oiled machine that they were, tying murders and crimes together quickly, and didn't expect them to have the ability to track him the way they were. He was used to American police who never seemed to be able to get ahead of the murders and whose system didn't work so well together. After a few days with the metal man and after being in so many cities that were crowded with policemen searching, Earle and the metal man parted ways, and Earle continued his journey to try and confuse the authorities on where he was, as there could easily be so many witnesses seeing him. After one ride would drop him off and he would thank them, he would wait until they were out of sight and start hitchhiking all over again. He wanted to make his way towards America where he felt that he could slip through the cracks, and he was closer at the finish of that first day, taking numerous different rides, thinking that police would need some time to untangle the web of deceit he had left behind for them in terms of location. Now in Wacopa, which is said to be just 5 miles from the border of the U.S., Earle walked into a store called Morgan's General Store to get himself some dinner as he sat down on the front porch in front of the store to eat his dinner in peace. The owner of the general store, named Leslie Morgan, immediately recognized Earle as the man that had been plastered in the newspapers everywhere, which funnily enough he had a chance to stare at all day on his own newspaper racks. While Earle was sitting and eating his food, Leslie quietly and quickly called the authorities. There was only one man on duty, Mr. Gray, who dropped everything to get to Wacopa as fast as possible. Leslie could do nothing but watch as Earle finished his dinner of cheese and bread, get up and walk away, happy as can be, knowing that he could now walk the 5 miles to the U.S. border. When the Officer Gray finally reached the general store, Earle was nowhere to be found, but the owner was able to point in the direction that Earle had started walking. The officer took off running in the direction that Earle was heading as he was able to track him with his muddy shoe prints and disheveled shrubbery. Officer Gray would now be tracking Earle for hours into the night as both of them had to cross some train tracks, and finally, after hours of searching, he was able to get eyes on Earle. He drew out his gun and ordered Earle to stop where he was. Earle stopped and raised his hands into the air, not knowing how or why he was being stopped, telling the officer that his name was Virgil Wilson, who was just a day worker and trying to make his way to his next employment area. The officer escorted Earle on foot the distance back to the patrol vehicle and then took him to a place called Killarney, which was in Manitoba, because this police station had a cell to hold the man as his identity could be confirmed, and it was the closest. The tiny cell could barely contain the man as the officer put Earle in the tiny cage. Earle laid upon the metal bed. The officer was not used to such a ruckus as he was only a deputy in the boonies and couldn't wait to let the others know who he had in custody. The officer headed to the closest general store to send a telegram to none other than Mr. George Smith to recant the capture and make sure this Virgil man really was Earle. Officer Gray was so proud of himself that he decided to buy himself a cigar to celebrate on the walk back. When he got back inside the station, the once filled cell was now empty, and there were no signs of Earle anywhere. The officer ran quickly back to the general store to send another message about the Dark Strangler and how he was once back out on the streets. George Smith had never let up the search even after Officer Gray had telegraphed about Earle's capture because there had been reports of him captured before, which all turned out to be false alarms. However, when the message came in about this Virgil man having escaped this cell, he knew without a doubt this was Earle, as he sent an entire troop of officers on a train headed south of the border as he knew that Earle was on the run and trying to get to the U.S. as quickly as he could. George had wanted to stay ahead of this monster. The entire day that had fell upon Earle after his escape from the tiny cell, he was hiding in the shadows of the brush near railroad tracks, just waiting for a train to come and take him away to freedom as he had done dozens of times before. It was said Earle had been hiding on something called a grain tower with a grain elevator attached, waiting for a train. When I looked this up, it kind of looked like a silo, and I guess these are filled with like grains and cereals to store them in bulk. When Earle heard the sound of the train heading at him, he did what he had done a million times, which was to drop onto the very last cart of the train as the train would slow coming through a town or a city. Usually the last cars of the train are where passengers' luggage was kept, and this is why Earle would fall onto the last car undetected. But this train was different. This train was special. This train, as Earle climbed into the last car, had been fitted with another additional car in the back that Earle would see was filled to the brim with police officers as they all drew their weapons on Earle. This car was taking the numerous officers to the destinations they were assigned to, in search of the man who had just entered the train car. So he quite literally dropped into their laps, which to me is the best end to this story ever. I loved it. The officers on the train ride back took his clothes as evidence, and he was put into other clothing too small for him. Apparently, as they were escorting Earle to the police station from the train, a few thousand people showed up to get a glimpse of the Dark Strangler and to celebrate his capture. Not surprising, Earle didn't admit to anything, although dozens of witnesses picked him out of lineups with men that looked like Earle time and time again. Earle kept on his Virgin Wilson bit, even when the authorities had brought in landladies of various boarding houses that he had stayed in during his attacks, and they even brought in his ex-wife, Aunt Lillian, and Uncle Willis, who continued to confirm his identity. The San Francisco Police Department sent their captain all the way up to Canada in person to hand over a copy of Earle's fingerprints, and they would be compared to the man in capture who was still claiming to be Virgil. They were a match, of course. Earle was then charged with the single murder of Emily Patterson, to which they had insurmountable evidence against him, and knowing that he would hang for this murder alone, the police didn't feel they needed to try him for the rest of the murders, and as countless family members of other murders were pleading with Earle to take responsibility for his actions so they could have closure, still he refused. Although his Virgil facade had been pushed to the side, and Earle was now at least able to say that he was indeed Earle Nelson, he didn't want to accept anything. He had done nothing because he was a man of God and not capable of such brutality. Earle, still the scripture recanter, as he had always been, still held out as the hanging drew closer, as well as death. 3 murders had been committed in 1925 after Earle was released from the hospital of women named Elma Wells, who was found stuffed into an empty apartment she was showing, Elizabeth Jones, who had been strangled to death with what was said to be her own necklace, and a poor woman named Daisy Anderson, who had also been found naked in her own boarding home. The families of these women pleaded with Earle to tell them that he had done the crimes, as well as some families of another 3 women from Philadelphia that had been found strangled and raped after the fact as well. These women were named Ola McCoy, Lena Weiner, and Mary Murray, and these would have all happened in November of 1925. The evidence in these murders were easy to connect as the men's clothing in the homes were taken after the crimes, but still Earle claimed to know nothing about the crimes and the brutality. There would be questions that still stand to this day on which crimes Earle Nelson committed or may not have. Once the authorities were done asking Earle questions because they could tell that he was not going to confess, they let the press ask their questions. Everyone, everywhere, wanted to know why he committed these heinous acts, why he was so brutal, and why he chose to do the things he did. Everyone knew what Earle had done, with or without his confessions. His sins were clear for all of the world to see. This is when, according to a source called crimefeed.com, Earle Nelson would tell the press, quote, "I only do my lady killings on Saturday nights," end quote. It was said not only did Earle give this little quip, but ended up confessing to his crimes in the most brutal, nightmarish way, with details so disturbing they couldn't even be publicized. During Earle's trial, a slew of witnesses, specialists, doctors, and of course Aunt Lillian, were all brought out in Earle's insanity defense. No one was denying the crimes that Earle had already admitted to and gave details about, but rather his state of mind during the crimes. Aunt Lillian would say, while afraid of him, that instead of being this madman everyone thought him to be, that he was more like a child. She spoke of Earle's anger tantrums and apparent depression that was quickly followed by mania. Earle's ex-wife was also called to the stand and gave testimony about Earle leaving in one outfit and returning in another, and of course about his sexual preferences. The prosecution called one witness who was said to be a psychiatrist who would call Earle a, quote, constitutional psychopath, but also said he was legally sane. After the jury set out to deliberate, it was less than an hour that the jury would come back with a guilty verdict where Judge Andrew Dysart handed Earle a sentence of death. After the sentence, Earle granted interviews with the press trying to run with this notion of, again, being innocent, but no one was buying it. When the day of his execution arrived, Earle had told the press that he made his peace with God. The last few hours of his life was spent reciting the book of Revelations. As Earle climbed the stairs of the gallows on January 13th, 1928, the crowd that had gathered was loud and ready for this monster to be gone from this earth. With no hesitation, Earle's neck was placed in the noose, and with irony, the floor would fall beneath him as he would strangle to death himself, as many of the victims he took from the world did. And that, my friends, is the story of Earle Nelson, murderer, rapist, necrophiliac, pedophile, and sick piece of shit. So this story was so fascinating to me because of his upbringing. Like, people in the world of true crime are always wondering if it's nature versus nurture that makes people these sick, twisted fuckers who do stuff like this. I have always thought that it was a little bit of both because we hear of killers who had fantasies since their younger years of sadistic things. And obviously there are others who have horrific childhoods that then they turn out to be shitbags as well. I definitely feel like in this case that the first head injury for Earle played a major role in his aggression and sadistic nature, don't you? Like, something was wrong with him after that accident, and I wish his grandma would have just taken him to the hospital or whatever to get him looked at, instead of just putting him to bed for 6 days. That's insane. Think of the lives that could have potentially been saved had she just taken him to the doctor. Like, he was twitching and jerking and not making any sense. I don't understand that. Also, the shaming of Earle, of his human impulses like masturbation, in my opinion, is just awful. They can't help the way they feel. And I feel like growing up in such a strict religious way that his grandma raised them all just ruined all those kids' life. And obviously some made it out, but some didn't. Yikes, I can't imagine living this way. I'm like the complete opposite with my own children. I am open with them. Like, we talk about age-appropriate sexual things when it comes to that time, and we leave the conversation open for any questions or talks at any times. Like, I want my children to be informed and know that everything they feel or question is completely normal, and that they have someone to turn to talk about the uncomfortable stuff. Because as we've learned from history, or at least most of us have, it's not good to pretend that sex doesn't exist, because guess what? It does, and it's all right, and shouldn't be shameful. That's just my opinion. I feel like if I want my kids to grow up with healthy sexual behaviors and healthy relationships in life, we gotta teach them what is what and be open to the conversation. Like, it's honestly embarrassing, and this is no offense, but to a lot of men that are my age or even older, like, they don't even know the anatomy of women. Like, the stuff that you see that men literally think that women can control their menstruation or like hold the babies in, or just the stuff that they just do not understand is just showing a lack of awareness. And it doesn't surprise me that we've had so many issues with that in the past. We have to teach them what is what. I know that no one taught me shit when it came to this stuff, and it showed in my terrible decision making in my younger years, just saying. Anyways, I hope that you guys enjoyed this case, even though a few parts were absolutely horrific. Sorry about that, but it was part of the story. I hope that you guys will come on back next week as we dive into another case here on The Kill File. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop, either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on the Kill File's socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how the Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on the Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.